And then other organizations, they read the book, they wanted assessments or workshops or things. And that's actually where On Mission, my company, was born out of that, out of organizations caring so deeply about their mission that they didn't want to drift, under their leadership or under future leaders.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping take your leadership to the next level. My name is Sam, and I am your host. And if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, then you know this is a slightly different show. And if you're just listening to this, then know that this is the first video podcast with our first guest of 2025. This is something we're hoping to do more of in the future, and since most of our guests were recording on a video conference call, we thought, hey, why not record a video as well? And so that's what this is going to be. If you'd like to watch this episode, I'll leave a link to that down in the show notes. So on today's episode, Richard has a great conversation with Becca Spradlin. She is the founder of On Mission Advisors, specializes in executive facilitation, organizational assessment, strategy design, execution, and change management. Becca started On Mission to help Christian business and nonprofit leaders define, protect, and champion what matters most in light of eternity. She has facilitated workshops, strategy design, and evaluations of business and nonprofits across 5 continents. She is certified in change management, adult learning, and human-centered design. She holds a master's degree in applied economics from Johns Hopkins University and undergraduate degrees in business and communications from Grove City College. She's also just written a book called Lead on Mission, Advance Faith at Work, Avoid Mission Drift, Build a Legacy in Light of Eternity. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation with Becca. As always, I'll leave links to all of her information in the show notes. And with that, I'll turn it over to Richard.
Well, as always, it's my privilege to have a special guest with me today. And I love these interviews because there's so many fascinating people out there these days that are serving the Lord, that are leading well, that are thinking insightfully about very important issues, and we just learn so much every time we have one of these interviews. And I'm very excited today to have Becca Spradlin with me. Welcome, Becca.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's good to get to see you face to face. We've corresponded, but it's great to visit with you. And Becca, this is a leadership podcast. We talk about leadership issues, which you're very familiar. But I always like just to begin by just having our guests introduce us to yourself. Especially your leadership journey. Sure. You focus on a lot of stuff that is very important to me as well. But I don't think people don't just necessarily come out of the womb immediately thinking about mission drift and things like that. But so how did you get to where you are today? What kind of experiences have you had that has put you in the place where you're so passionate about these things today?
Yeah, thank you so much. Certainly coming out of the womb, I was not thinking about mission drift. But the 2 factors, I think, of my upbringing that the Lord used in my leadership journey was that I have 2 parents that love the Lord, and we're often in the Word of God. And so I think when you see, especially now as a parent, my kids seeing us in the Word of God, now it's on my phone, but in the Bible, in the Word, I think that example speaks volumes and really conveys what is most important. And so, my dad passed away when I was a teenager, when I was 18, and even though even though it's been decades, I don't know anyone who could quote scripture like he could. He knew scripture. He memorized it. That was really a big part of his life. My mom was someone who was always leading Bible studies. Even now she's in a nursing home, but she still leads a Bible study. So even when you have difficult circumstances, they just didn't let that stop them. So I think those were huge example for me and for my brother. And the other thing I think now as an adult, I look back on, I took for granted that kind of entrepreneurial thread that was in my family. My dad had a full-time job, super hardworking, but he also had a side business. And I
Wow.
think we had other family members that had businesses. And when you see that, it makes it feel like that's possible to have your own company, even though that certainly was not my plan or intention. As it turns out, now years later, my brother and I both have our own businesses.
Huh.
And I'm newer at it than he is, but God just kind of guides you with those family and life experiences. But I always knew I wanted to study business. That was just one of my interests. Went to college, studied business, and had the opportunity to do a missions trip during one of the spring breaks. And on one of these trips, we went to Haiti. And once I saw the level of poverty there, it just really affected me. And I just came back saying, I can't just, my plan was just to go and do consulting and consulting internships, make a lot of money, give money. But I just knew I wanted my career to be different now. So I started studying economic development, and that led into a vocation of mostly focused on international economic development and microfinance specifically. And so the Lord ended up placing me at a microfinance rating agency, a specialized rating agency of all things, where I could use that kind of consulting lens, go in and do research on investment funds in microfinance, but also research these microfinance institutions and do assessments of them. And along the journey, I got connected with Hope International, which is a nonprofit that works globally, is based in Pennsylvania, and they pair the gospel and the good news of Christ with microfinance. And so that kind of led to my next chapter, but that pairing where I could, use my faith actually in the workplace, and those things were married together. It was a huge way God was working in my story.
Wow. I'm one that's certainly had a rich heritage as well. And it always encourages me to see people that, of course, none of our parents are perfect, but some of us just really are blessed with godly parents or, parents that just gave really great models for us. And I love that when kids just embrace what God gave them. There's some that, and of course, some grow up in very dysfunctional homes, and there's a lot to reject and get over. But there's also some that are born in homes where there's all kinds of rich heritage, and they squander it. They don't take anything from it, or they are threatened by it. And so I love that when you just kind of take what your parents have to offer you, and you're a mother of 3 girls. I've got 3
I am.
kids. I could only afford 1 daughter, though. I had 2 boys and then a daughter. And after that 1 daughter, I thought I better quit. And so actually our producer, Sam, that's his wife today. So, she was very dear and sweet to me. But 3 girls, that's a whole leadership issue in itself there.
And we are on the learning curve. We are on that learning curve.
What's their ages now?
9, 6, and 4.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah. Well, good for you. So, yeah, there'll be another leadership book coming out here eventually when you get them through their teen years.
Yes, the parenting journey.
Now, we'll get to your book here in just a second, but you have done a lot, particularly with mission and mission drift. And that's kind of a newer, in the last several years, mission drift has become much more of a focus. And I think that's something that probably is much more widespread than a lot of organizations realize. But tell us what that is, and tell us how can you tell? I mean, what are the signs that perhaps your organization is suffering from mission drift?
Yeah, so I'll kind of go back to when I joined Hope International. It was right around 2013, and that was right around the time that Peter Greer, who's the CEO of Hope International, wrote a book called Mission Drift. And it was specifically focused on Christian nonprofits drifting from the Christian kind of elements, the faith elements of their mission. Mission drift, as you kind of mentioned, is a much broader topic than that, even in the microfinance sector. Any socially responsible business, any nonprofit, mission drift is a topic, a threat to them. But this narrower focus on specifically for Christian nonprofits and businesses coming into Hope right when that book came out. and having a background in ratings, they asked me, can you develop an assessment for us to use internally to help us know, in Peter Greer's words, it's not if, but where we're drifting. And so over 10 years ago, we started piloting these assessments internal to Hope. And so, again, Mission Drift, it will look a little different. There are some common themes, but it's based on what your mission is. What is the mission God has called you to, that kind of like center of the bullseye, that higher purpose he's called you to? And then where are we most likely going to be compromising on that? So we started doing these assessments internal to Hope. And then other organizations, they read the book, they wanted assessments or workshops or things. And that's actually where On Mission, my company, was born out of that, out of organizations caring so deeply about their mission that they didn't want to drift, under their leadership or under future leaders. So that's really what kind of brought me along the journey, which kind of put me into this business, and how God used those circumstances certainly to guide me in this work. So the mission drift we focus on as a company, and that the book Lead on Mission focuses on, is specifically for Christian leaders. The book focuses on Christian business leaders, how to both cultivate faith today and then perpetuate it beyond yourself. What are the structures you can put in place? And the learnings really pulled out of case studies. So case studies of companies that had these kind of faith-driven values and don't have them anymore. What happened? And then companies that have managed to maintain them over decades. What can we learn from both sides of that? And then what are those common practices? It looks a little different between nonprofits and for-profits, but for for-profits, when we see that aligned ownership, leadership, and governance, that's when we really start to see missions last and avoiding drift over generations of leaders. So a lot of different practices in the book, but that's really been our focus.
Yeah, and I know a lot of times, especially Christian leaders, can certainly begin or start an organization with very strong convictions and a sense of mission, purpose. But boy, there's lots of things that can start moving you away from that. We're just financial issues, Well, we've got a great purpose here, but hey, we got to pay the bills. So let's partner here. Let's start doing it this way. And before you know it, you don't look anything like that organization, that you started out with. And you mentioned governance as well. Boy, I tell you, sometimes it only takes one or two wrong board members to begin to push back against the mission and start questioning things that were supposed to be bedrock. And I've certainly seen that. You want to be so careful with your board members and the selection of those as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hiring, certainly at the leadership level, but really all levels. Again, we're not discriminating based on faith, but hiring on those values and finding values aligned people, and then really being careful to vet, especially the leadership, partner owners, future owners, and board members. I mean, I was on a call with someone just yesterday, and they said, a board member joined their board and ended up serving less than a year, and took their organization from its focus on being a Christian, led, Christian motivated company to being more spiritual, and even programmatic changes they made, and didn't even serve. And then they left early from their term, leaving this kind of, and so they had to, clean up after that. For just, it's remarkable how quickly, and that was one of the things we realized in the book. Some of these cases, it was more of an erosion over time, but one of the opening cases in the book, it was a matter of months. One leadership change, one ownership change, and the whole culture followed. And people leave. It leads to attrition. It leads to just, it really unravels and undoes decades of intentional spiritual leadership of a company, and mentorship and relationship that's built. It can be undone in months, which is just
and it's
very
heartbreaking,
sobering
isn't it?
reality.
Yeah, just so heartbreaking to see the devastation that can come with companies, organizations that were great, and people cared about their customer and their staff, and then all of a sudden it just becomes a war zone. It's amazing, a bad hire. I led a school for many years, and the saying there went, I've either hired or enrolled most of my problems. And
Wow.
if you either just hired the wrong staff or you enrolled the students who shouldn't have ever been a student of a seminary, and the next thing you know, you're having all kinds of grief and meetings and interventions. And so, boy, I tell you, just at the front door, just as best you can, be careful with that. Now you've written a great new book. It's pretty new release. Lead on Mission, Advance Faith at Work, Avoid Mission Drift, Build a Legacy of Eternal Impact. Those are some pretty high aspirations there in that
Yes.
book. And I know it's been very well received. And I was privileged to get to read the advanced copy, write a foreword for this book. So just full disclosure, I've written a foreword for it. That's so I know that it's good. And I wouldn't be promoting something I didn't believe in, and think there was lots of wisdom here. And you talk about that legacy as well. We've mentioned it here, but it's one thing to lead well while you're in the seat, while you're in the leadership role. But it's just interesting to me. I mean, I may have shared with you when I was a pastor, I came into a church that was in financial crisis. It had been hemorrhaging members, declining for 7 straight years quite dramatically. They couldn't even pay the pastor. The pastor before me, they had to reduce his salary significantly just to, make ends meet. And ultimately, that pastor was a good man, but he actually suffered a nervous breakdown just trying to turn the tide of decline and so on. And that was my first church. That's I cut my teeth on a church that drove my predecessor to a nervous breakdown. But by God's grace, a lot of things were turned around. We actually, not only did we get into a better financial position, we actually paid off our mortgage early, and suddenly we were mortgage free. We had, money, and we could hire staff and do all kinds of things and renovations. And so when I left, we had, multiple staff. We were debt free. Things were good. Had money in the bank. But then about 3 pastors after me, they're literally selling off property and any asset they have because they're in such debt and in financial disarray. And it's like, when I walked out the door, that church had never been stronger financially. How can, if they just kept on doing the basics of what we were doing, there was a recipe for growth and so on. And it's heartbreaking. And so now, in fact, they sold that property I worked so hard to pay off and develop. They finally downsized and kind of sold what was left of their property to a church, and they took a smaller facility. And so now I go back, and the property that I spent all my time on isn't even the same church anymore. And you look at that, and it's so disappointing when you think of how hard I worked to be debt free and financially strong. And then, but in our polity of my denomination, I didn't get to pick my my successor. I would never have picked a couple of the people that church picked, but and the guy, once he drove that church into financial ruin, then he left the church and took up a different career, And so, but so you talk about a lot of things in this book, but one is just how do you lead in such a way that your leadership outlasts your tenure in the chair, and so how do you do that? Because that's a different kind of. Is that a different kind of leadership? Are you?
Yeah.
Are you just trying to lead as best you can and then just hoping you get lucky with your successors, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think even as I was going through the research process and compiling these case studies, because this concept, what I call faith-forward leadership, really came to mind because there was something unique about the organizations that were able to maintain their mission over time. So how did they maintain it, for generations to come? What were they doing? What were they doing differently? And where we landed was ultimately, you're right. It hinges on who's in the leadership seat, who are in those governance, ownership leadership seats. That really matters. And so we introduced the kind of concept we call broadly structures. What are the structures that we invest in today, that we coach on today, that we build into our people, that give us a better likelihood going forward that we're going to continue to develop and select the aligned people who are both competent and aligned. So it's a smaller pool of people. How can we set ourselves up for that? And so there's structures you can put in place to help cultivate your faith within the work environment today. You know, chaplaincy, opt-in Bible studies, caring programs, different things that help, nurture this. And really, when you get clarity on what that core higher purpose is, how do you infuse that into everything? And so the ones that did better in terms of perpetuating it beyond themselves and beyond their tenures often had very intentional ownership or leadership transitions. They were looking for people in alignment, and a number of other, we call them faith-forward leadership practices that we highlight in the book. But the model we focus is on how do you define, protect, and champion what matters most. So the practices center on those things. How do we define, protect, and champion that higher purpose that the Lord's given us? So yeah, there definitely is a difference. There's an extra level, I would say, of intentionality that happens under your own tenure, how you're spending your time developing the next generation, selecting the next generation. And a much smaller number of Christian-led businesses and Christian leaders are doing this today. It's uncommon. So we wanted to highlight some of those great practices that are happening.
Yeah, and I know that it's an age-old debate about, do you hire from within or without? And you can certainly develop a culture that values certain things as you develop your leaders from within, but
Business around too helps, find aligned ownership as well. That was a key part of their journey, which helped them survive, the economic recession and other things that really hit their industry hard. So it does happen, but we kind of call it the external CEO disadvantage. There are exceptions, absolutely, especially if there's a kind of a turnaround needed. You find that competent, mission-aligned CEO. But often, in the case of Service Master, I mean, they kept, they were almost like ahead of their time in the sense of integrating faith into their core objectives and really living that out sincerely and growing rapidly. And they managed to do that even after going public because they had developed internal leaders. They were very intentional. They called it shingles on a roof, where they'd have the CEO become the chairman and they would continue to mentor each other and or work with each other, partner with each other. So that helped them for several different leaders. And then ultimately they started getting CEOs from outside. And I think the disadvantage comes in when you're kind of pressed up against a wall, you're in a rock, between a rock and a hard place. What happens to the values? Do they help you get out of it? Are they kind
Yeah.
of an asset that you lean into, or do they get shelved? And when you see that, when you're a leader, an executive leader in the company, and you see how the CEO navigates that before you step into that leadership position, it gives you a bit, rails to run on, and just experience and exposure to do that well and see how they've done it well. So I think that practice really helped them and so many other organizations see how do the values play out when it gets hard.
Yeah.
And when you come in, like you said, when you come in from the outside, you think you understand the values, but you won't understand it it's at at an arm's length.
Yeah. And, I'm in a funny place, and there's, a number like this. I lead Blackaby Ministries. My dad founded it. I was his oldest son. My personality is very different than my dad. My leadership style is very different than him, but I did know his values, and I know certain things, if we were to do them, my dad would, not like it. And so I feel like we've taken the ministry to places that he never took it, even just from some leadership decisions. But I'm pretty confident our values, our message still has stayed true to what he taught. But oftentimes it's the next generation. It's the founder's grandkids. Like, the Cathy family from Chick-fil-A live around here, and we, some of them. I go to the church they grew up in, so we know the Cathy family, and they've moved on to the grandchildren in the CEO seat now, and I know they were try to be very intentional about that, because the oldest son can often kind of carry things on from the founder, but the next generation, and the sad thing is, I've seen some organizations where they went with family, and that was kind of the mistake, that actually an outsider would have been better aligned, because they had the same last name didn't mean that they understood the values or embraced them. And so, yeah, there's lots of issues when it comes to getting that, where you don't drift too far from what was really important when an organization was begun. But you mentioned also just things that especially Christians are doing, and that's a big area that I spent a lot of time in, is Christians trying to lead in a Christian way, a God-honoring way. And it's not so hard if you own the company. Private companies, there's a lot more freedom. If you want to bring in a chaplain, you want to have prayer at the beginning of your staff meeting, or whatever it is you want to do, there's some more freedom there. But also I work with CEOs of publicly traded companies, right, and they're under scrutiny all the time. And yet there are ways to exert a Christian influence even in a publicly traded company. You have to be careful. You probably need to get legal advice along the way, but you can do it. And what are you seeing, Becca, as far as, because I think there's some enormous possibilities right now. It's a very fruitful mission field, the marketplace, that still a lot of people just don't understand just what could be done. But are there some just things that, maybe some stories or things that you're seeing that just really would kind of stand out to say, wow, that was brilliant, however God led them to do that.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, just to underscore what you just mentioned there, the opportunity and the urgency, I think all the statistics we're seeing in the U.S. certainly, point to decline in people practicing their faith. Most people who grew up, or many people who grew up in the church, by the time they hit that 18 to 29 mark, they're leaving the church. But almost all of them are going to be entering the workforce. So I think the opportunity to see a movement of God in the workplace is, we are ripe. The fields are ripe for harvest. And you're absolutely right. There are really great things happening in private side and publicly owned companies too. And this is where abiding, I think, becomes so important, because it will look different in different places. Absolutely underscore your point about getting legal counsel for your industry, for your state. One of the interviews I had the privilege of doing was with Dave Dunkel, who's the founder of Team Force.
Mm-hmm. I'll be with him. I'll have dinner with him this week.
Yeah, I know you all know each other, and I was so moved, because he was growing in his faith right around the time he was taking his company public. So he had this existing business. He was growing in his faith. He really just sought to earnestly integrate his faith. And, he just started simply by reading his Bible at his desk. That was where he sensed the Lord leading him. And he was just constantly just seeking the Lord for different direction. But one of the quotes that kind of stood with me, and he's like, God is not unfamiliar with the nuances of a publicly traded company.
Yeah.
That is not too great a thing for him. And so when Dave would find himself in a place that he wasn't sure what to do, he would be open with his colleagues on, like, I'm going to pray about that. I'm not sure what, the next step is. And he'd pray and he'd listen to the Lord, and the Lord would give him, an impression or speak to him, and then he'd go back and act on that. So he would kind of live out his faith in that way, among other things, ministry things they were doing in the business too. And this is a publicly traded company. I mean, ServiceMaster is publicly traded for a lot of the time, for decades, that they were really living out their faith. Coca-Cola Consolidated, another great example of a company that is, publicly traded, but is doing very intentional work to care well for their employees, and seeing that kind of eternal fruit coming out in the workplace. So yeah,
and I know some people, they live in fear. Oh, I could get sued if I do that. I've known folks that work for very, very publicly traded, some of the top 20 biggest companies in the world, but they're holding a Bible study during the lunch hour and having over 100 employees showing up, just free, their free will. It's during their free time, but. And some of the stuff that is happening, and I know the first blush, a lot of times people would say, "Oh, I could never do that. I'd get into trouble." And you'd have more freedom than you might realize. Sometimes you do have to be careful. There's some things you need to be aware of, but there's also a lot of opportunities that are being missed because we just assume that that's impossible.
Right. I do think the enemy uses fear to hold a lot of people back. I think there's a lot of people who are just unaware that they could be doing this. But I think intentionality, to your point, is just key in how you go about doing it. And from a legal perspective, usually lawyers kind of would tell me just being consistent in how you communicate. These things are optional, opt-in activities. They don't influence your progress at the organization. But I do think it's an asset for companies to realize that, people bring their whole selves to work. It feels disingenuous to not be like, oh, we can't talk about faith here. It doesn't feel like a sincere work environment when you feel that kind of that stifling. And I've talked to people who often feel that way in their workplaces. So creating that space for those who want to explore more or grow more in the workplace and find other, like-minded believers in the workplace, it's a real way to build the culture.
Yeah. And, of course, lawyers are going to always be risk averse. And obviously you don't want to be careless or foolish, but I think there also comes a moment, I think, in a very secularized society where Christians have to say, you know what, I am a Christian and this is important to me, and there's some risk worth taking, and even if some people are offended, there will also be others that could end up getting saved. And, and I've talked to CEOs that had a direct report that was just getting a little owly, and they were thinking, maybe I need to fire this guy. But as they prayed, they felt like God said, no, lean into this guy. And we found out that the guy was going through a very nasty divorce, breakup. His teenage son was into drugs, and he was just totally distracted with his personal issues, and ultimately led the employee to Christ and saw the person's whole life turn around, restore his relationship with his son, and so many good things happened. But here was a person all along. This business person could have been a pastor, a shepherd in their workplace, and when they began doing that, and of course, the more they did that, business improved. Numbers were up. And when you've got healthy, vibrant, joyful employees that are trying to work to the glory of God, that's usually good for business. Right. What anything else that you're seeing just in the marketplace today? I know there's always trends, and we're sort of post-COVID now. For a while, that was just consuming so much of the conversation, and but in this sort of era that we're in now, Is there anything else you're seeing trend-wise or opportunity-wise in the marketplace?
Yeah, I do think the silver tsunami is still very much underway. So I think the kind of speaking to the urgency of a lot of the baby boomers who really were, integrating their faith more, maybe toward the end of their tenure, wanting to see that culture and the values that they've built over years or decades even. The urgency really to find aligned ownership. I think that is going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations. Is there a sufficient pool of mission aligned buyers out there? And I think from the people I interviewed, it doesn't seem like that is the case. So I think more companies are looking at even giving away their businesses and looking toward ESOPs, employee owned structures, as a way, or when they rank order their kind of values and priorities in terms of how to keep their companies on mission long term. We're starting to see, I think, more of that happening because there doesn't seem to be enough, mission aligned buyers that you feel like you can trust, both in this sale or who else they might sell it to in the future, that won't lose sight of the values, really just try to just become more exclusively financially focused in terms of the business. So I think seeing more of that's what a lot of the interviews we did were talking more about, that to help preserve the values. And there it becomes, it doesn't eliminate the risk of drift by any means, but it becomes more of a governance issue. You're introducing boards to companies that may not have boards before. And how are we going to make sure at the governance level where we continue to get aligned folks? So it goes back to the practices of hiring around, ownership, leadership, and governance. How do we keep those in alignment? And also change. I think I always give a kind of public service announcement. We are, want to really be sensitive to drift, but we are not opposed to change. Like you shared the example between you and your dad being different and growing, the ministry in different ways. Certain structures we used before in a business may not serve us well in the next generation. And even kind of monitoring how we do, ministry in the business. If it's not relevant, if people aren't engaging, what different things can we offer to team members, new generations, younger generations of employees that will be relevant for them? So I think, just always keeping an eye toward, we can change the structures, but the core stays the same. And your story, I think, exemplified that.
Yeah. Beck, let me throw just a curveball at you to see what you think about. During COVID, all kinds of organizations began work from home, work remotely, and so on. And there were people working even on significant teams that had never actually met face to face for a while. And I'm personally seeing, and then, people just thought, well, boy, this is great. I can work from home and work in my pajamas and whatever else. And it seems to me that there's a trend moving back away from that. I know entire companies that sold their headquarters, said we don't even need this big building anymore. And so there's certainly been a lot of movement that way, but I realize, technology, Zoom and other things allows a lot of communication better than it used to. You don't have to always get on an airplane and fly to New York City to have a meeting anymore. But in terms of culture, there's certainly some challenges, isn't there? If you want to have a culture of Christ-likeness and service and ministry and care, it's a little harder when you're calling in from different states but working together on a team. Are you seeing anything with that as far as culture and working from home and remotely?
Yeah, and I think every company, and even different industries, will take a different approach in how they do that and how that relates just to the work that they're doing. But it does force a bit of a different, and this is why we need to be able to change as companies and how we do, quote unquote, like the ministry, because there isn't that just water cooler conversation or just shoulder to shoulder, and kind of making, I think it comes with a different, again, it's all intentionality. So how are we, we're virtual most of the year, but how are we having maybe more quarterly retreats together than we had before, or scheduling time, or making sure that our one-on-ones are having maybe more or longer, or having more personal time to check in with people. Because I think, especially for the younger generations coming into the workforce with all the kind of, the phone screen generation coming into the workforce, I think there's a real opportunity to be different, and to really spend that extra time with people, and that coffee break meeting or things like that. Because if not, they can be living in these worlds that are so virtual, that they even their sense of identity is kind of fluid, I guess. So
Yeah.
I do think that it comes with a different level. It's just one of the examples of how do we change the structures? How do we make sure, we're hiring well, if we're hiring all, virtually, and being intentional and make the use of those in-person times, scheduling more of them, getting the team together, and planning, budgeting time and money and resource to do that.
Yeah, I think and it could be a huge value add. Work for us, and you get personal in-person attention and concern. That might be considered a real a perk in the years to come. But, well, Becca, tell me, if an organization just wanted to make use of your services and the help that you bring, what kind of things could you help people with? If an organization just says, I'd love just to bring Becca in and just have her take a good look at what we're doing, what kind of things might that involve? What could you do for an organization?
Sure. So we worked with companies, if we think about center of the bullseye, it's that core purpose, especially for companies that have been around for generations. There's always something written in terms of their mission, vision, values, but maybe it's not, the language needs a refresh. So really our heart to help individuals is those that pursuing this higher purpose in their work, in their nonprofit, in their business, or in their board service. How do we pay kind of close attention to what that higher purpose is as we maybe refresh their mission, vision, values, as we do a strategic plan, or build out the governance, providing governance support on that. So we'll help on those things with that eye toward avoiding drift and really elevating and keeping that mission front and center. Another service we started doing more of is what we call our North Star guidance and guardrails. And I think it's just really important. Most organizations will have a written mission, again, mission, vision, values, but have they actually written or even discussed what mission drift looks like? Have they had a conversation with those influencers, whether it's owners, board members, other leaders? If they were all to sit down and write something, would it all be the same or would it be different? But just having and facilitating that conversation. What is drift? What is not drift? What can we change and do differently, but we don't think it's drift? And then around like kind of key, I'll say, drift prone issues, usually related to funding, investors, the financial piece, the hiring, leadership pieces, and partnership and other things. We kind of go into each of those topics. What are our boundaries here that we think will help us stay on mission long term? So when companies define those guidance and guardrails, it really helps them stay, build, in that moment, you're building alignment on the team and the leaders and owners and board members in that season. And also it serves as a resource to hire on at the governance level. So we were trying to help work with teams to get clarity on these things. Again, mission, vision, values, this guidance, guardrails, your strategy, your governance, and then helping them, those are resources they can continue to use going forward to make sure that they're recruiting the right board members, the right leaders in alignment who see these documents and are like, yes, that's awesome. I want to be a part of this. Or ones who are like, this, I have the clarity on what you guys are about, and that's not for me. So we really just want to help create resources to help organizations get clarity, again, define, protect, and champion kind of what matters most. So those are the areas we focus on.
Oh, good. And of course, your book is available now. We'll have links to that in the show notes, and links to Becca and her business, and just all the different resources that she's produced. A delightful, helpful, insightful person. I know that you'll benefit from getting to read her material and perhaps even use the services of her company. But Becca, it's been great to be with you today. I hope that you've had a great Christmas season with those 3 girls of yours.
Absolutely.
and now, yeah, that's about this time. We had a house full of grandkids, and they all got sick, and one even ended up in the hospital. So we're just getting on the other side of that now, getting back into real life again.
Yes, the post-holiday sickness is kind of...
Yes, and get that worked through. So thank you, Becca, and I hope that our listeners will take advantage of just her and all that she has. And we just wish you the very best, Becca, in 2025 and all that God has for you and your work as well.
Likewise. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.